Welcome to the Fear and Greed Weekend Edition, the week that was, a wrap of the biggest stories over the past 7 days. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Morning, Michael.
It was a huge week for share markets, energy prices, corporate takeovers, new global leaders, Gladys Berejiklian, and COVID timelines. Did you enjoy the week, Sean?
Well, it was pretty frantic, bookended by incredible moves on markets at the beginning of the week and the very surprising resignation of the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian at the end of the week. It was pretty mad.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Let's jump into it. I thought the week was really just crazy for equity markets, and it got even more so basically every day. First we went down, then up, then down. What was going on?
Well, perhaps we should just say it's very volatile, the Australian Stock Exchange at the moment. As you said, big falls, big rise, big falls. It was similar overseas, though not quite as drastic as it was in Australia. This is a global story. It's all about stagflation, or the fear of stagflation. That's what happens when you get rising interest rates and low economic growth. It hasn't really been a problem since the 70s. Where it's starting to kick in is the signs of price rises that companies are reporting. Transport costs are higher. Energy costs are much higher, and there's shortages. We've seen those lines in the UK and the stories out of China. There's also a shortage of global semiconductor chips. That's all pushing prices up. Also, China is slowing, particularly its factories, and that's all coming as central banks start talking about easing off on monetary policy. The heads of central banks in the US, the European Union, Japan and England this week all said that this higher price push was transitory, but investors just aren't so sure. In Australia, there's an extra factor. Commodity prices are high. Coal, gas, base metals, iron ore prices have rebounded. You put all that into the mix and the ASX isn't quite sure where to turn to. Do we actually have inflation? Do we have a pickup in the global economy? Or is it not really picking up as much as you'd expect given the reopening trade? The banks were really volatile this week. You're getting the Commonwealth Bank moving 2 or 3% in a day. Energy stocks were definitely better and gold was better. It certainly makes it a lot harder for all the big IPOs coming up. SG Lottery is the big one. That's supposed to be worth about $5 billion. It's really hard to pick where markets are going to go in the next month or so.
Yeah, it's been an extraordinary week, Sean. And international news, there's been plenty of that around as well. For me, one of the really interesting stories related to cryptocurrencies and two of the
No surprises, Michael. No surprises.
I am drawn to cryptocurrencies, partly because I don't really understand them that well, but I just find the volatility in Bitcoin in particular just fascinating. And we saw that this week because two of the world's largest Bitcoin exchanges have stopped taking new registrations for Chinese users, and that's because of the ban out of Beijing on cryptocurrency being used there. This is the central bank in China said all crypto-related transactions will be considered illicit financial activity. And when 40% of digital currency trading is out of China, that makes a fairly big impact on the market.
It does, but the interesting thing was that Bitcoin didn't actually lose too much value this week. It's volatile anyway. I would have thought at the beginning of the week when that came out that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies would have devalued, but it didn't really happen.
It's just hard to predict, isn't it?
It is. There's plenty else going on too around the world. Olaf Scholz, you'll hear his name a fair bit more. He's likely to be the new Chancellor of Germany, taking over from Angela Merkel. Mr. Scholz leads the centre-left Social Democrats. They won the biggest share of the vote, but they're in the midst of trying to find a dance partner to form a government. And Japan also will get a new prime minister. So the Liberal Democratic Party elected a new leader, Fumio Kishida. That follows the resignation of Yoshihide Suga, the prime minister, on the back of surging cases of COVID. Mr. Suga was only in the job for a year, though he did get to fit the Olympic Games in. A national election in Japan is due later this month. Also in international news, two of the big Canadian gold miners, Kirkland Lake and Agnico Eagle, will merge. That'll create a $24 billion giant that will compete hard with Australia's big gold producers, places like Newcrest and Northern Star.
Yeah, let's have a bit of a look at some of the local news from the week now, Sean. The week started with the Prime Minister saying he wanted to give people their lives back by Christmas. On Friday, we heard a bit more about that, about how that might actually happen, and it was really, the focus was on the international travel ban and the plan to lift that in November as states hit the 80% double jabbed mark. And a key part of it really is home quarantine for the fully vaccinated. But it's been a big week for numbers, particularly in Victoria.
Yeah, it's been bad news really, Michael. The numbers in Victoria have surged. Not helping were the AFL Grand Final parties last weekend, which now seem to have become super spreader events. The New South Wales case numbers have definitely plateaued, and that state is edging towards 70% full vaccination rates. Hopefully that state will hit that in a week's time. New South Wales also got a timeline this week about when they will get out of lockdowns. 80% is expected in the middle of this month. There'll be easing of more restrictions at that point, and then 90% in early December. Queensland's an interesting one. They're just a bit uncomfortable with the numbers in the Sunshine State. People are infectious while in the community, and we know with the Delta variant is when people are in the community, it tends to spread very quickly. There were some restrictions imposed on some local government areas in Queensland. The ACT started okay, but then they got a surge in rates on Thursday and Friday. Fortunately, that territory has high vaccination rates. The other things we found out this week around COVID supply is no longer a problem. Moderna and Pfizer, there's plenty of both those drugs, and they are rolled out to all peoples, no matter what your age. And the government also said it will allow rapid antigen tests at home for the beginning of next month. It's hard to know when all the reopenings will occur. New South Wales has its timeline. Victoria hasn't. Western Australia and Queensland remain fairly intransigent, saying they have no plans to open borders. Still a fair way to go.
Yeah, you mentioned, Sean, the timeline for New South Wales, and that was announced earlier in the week by New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, who has been arguably one of the strongest leaders during the pandemic. But yesterday, Sean, she dropped a bombshell.
She sure did. No one could see that coming. When all this occurred, that she had had a relationship with the ex-MP Darryl Maguire, who had been investigated by ICAC, there was certainly talk that Gladys was showing Teflon qualities, getting away with it thanks to COVID. Well, that sort of came back to hit her, obviously, yesterday. A surprise to everyone. I think ICAC needs to ensure that they've actually got something that they can stick on Ms. Berejiklian, because otherwise it's a bit of a wasted effort. She's done a terrific job for the state of New South Wales during the COVID pandemic in terms of the health and economic outcomes of that state. Obviously, the ICAC inquiry, though, is not something that she felt could go ahead and she could still be leader.
Yeah, absolutely right. And now, Sean, one of the other big stories this week was the housing market. We do seem to talk about this a lot, and it's because it is such a story that impacts on pretty much everybody in the country. The regulators and the banks are worried about soaring house prices. They've just been shooting up astronomically over the last 18 months, but no one seems to be listening.
That's exactly right. House prices are up 20% over the last year. They're the core logic numbers that came out yesterday. That's the best since 1989, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. It actually doesn't make sense. The Council of Financial Regulators, that's kind of the four big policy-making groups or economic policy-making groups, Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, Australian Securities and Investments Commission, Treasury and Reserve Bank, they get together. That council came out and said they're going to look at taking action to take some of the sting out of the market. That might mean increasing a minimum deposit a person needs or capping the amount of debt someone can take on. So that's part of it, but consumers are still buying. I mean, last weekend's national clearance rates were the best since April.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? There's been plenty of economic news around this week, but it's been a little bit unclear as to whether it's actually been a good or a bad week.
It's a bit like the financial markets. Retail trade came out, that was down during August, though probably not as bad as some people had thought. It wasn't quite a disaster. Reserve Bank credit data came out. Housing finance is still really strong. Dwelling approvals, they've been down for 3 months, then they jumped in August. Now, home builder brought forward a lot of it. That's why they went down. But just a bit of confidence back in that construction sector. Job vacancies were down 10% in the 3 months to August on a year earlier. But it's actually not that bad given we're in lockdowns. The financial budget outcome for last year came out, and that showed a deficit of $134 billion. But that was $80 billion better than thought. There's just not much direction around at the moment. No one's quite sure what will happen. The Reserve Bank board meets next week, and the central bank also releases its financial stability report. Hopefully this time next week, we'll have a bit better of an idea of where the economy's going.
Yeah, and Sean, how about the story through the week about the ACCC and Google? So the ACCC wants new powers to rein in Google's dominance in digital ad spend. And the thing that really blew me away was just how dominant Google actually is.
90% of digital ads have Google's fingerprint on them somewhere. Not just AdWords, but often it's the technology used to serve the ads to digital sites uses Google product. Rod Seams, the head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, said that dominance potentially harms rivals, and that's why he thinks new powers are needed. Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, said he'll consider that ACCC report.
Turning to corporate news now, Sean, Sigma Healthcare lobbed a bid through the week for Australian pharmaceutical industries. It topped the Wesfarmers bid made last month. Now, Sigma and API are rivals, and API actually bid for Sigma a few years ago.
They sure did, and Sigma knocked them back. This is a really tough sector because API and Sigma have these community service obligations where they must provide drugs to pharmacies within a 48-hour period of demand. So it's a huge logistics system, these companies. Now, Wesfarmers was hoping to buy API to get into the health sector. Sigma has come over the top. I mean, the good news for shareholders of API is that there's a bidding war on for the company, and that means you end up with higher prices. It wasn't the only takeover offer this week. A consortium led by US group TPG Capital made a $1.4 billion cash takeover offer for the salary and packaging group Smart Group Corporation. Not surprisingly, that consortium includes a super company, Aware Super. And then yesterday, Optus said it had sold a 70% stake in its Australian mobile tower network to Australian Super for $1.9 billion. Infrastructure, of course, is the hottest thing in the market if you're a super fund at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems to be a new development there every couple of days at the moment.
Sure does.
Now, another interesting story this week I thought was Qantas replacing the Perth to London flights with Darwin to London till next April. That came after Alan Joyce had talks with the McGowan government in Western Australia. I can't imagine the talks were particularly successful because Qantas has also delayed the return of WA to New South Wales and WA to Victoria flights. So it does pose the question of whether Alan Joyce has met his match in Mark McGowan.
It's a good question. They're two very, very strong leaders, but Alan Joyce undoubtedly is frustrated at the West Australian Premier and what his government is doing in terms of lockdowns. I think we all are.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Now, tell me about BHP. This was an interesting story during the week with a proxy advisor voting against the roadmap to renewable energy at AGMs in the UK and Australia.
Yeah, the proxy advisor Glass Lewis is one of the big ones. Proxy advisors are becoming much more influential because what they do is they advise shareholders on how they should vote on resolutions at AGMs. We've got the AGM season coming up in Australia. Glass Lewis has advised shareholders vote against BHP's roadmap to renewable energy. BHP has a net zero target by 2050. This is a really big issue for all companies, especially the miners and resource sectors this AGM season, because if the proxy advisors aren't voting for them, they run the risk of actually having the resolution voted down.
And one last story, Sean, and of course it involves TV and streaming. Seems to be a common thread between most of our episodes. Foxtel and the boss of Foxtel, Patrick Delaney, says the future of the cable channel is in streaming.
I think we all knew that. Maybe he just realised it this week. I'm not sure. Yeah, look, it's sort of a bit old world, a cable channel now, isn't it? None of my kids watch cable. They all stream everything, including KO, which is obviously a Foxtel streaming platform. Mr. Delaney came out this week. He said that he was targeting 5 million subscribers for Foxtel, up from 3.9 million, but it was really going to become a streaming service. He also hinted that he wanted to list on the ASX.
All right, Sean, now we get to the point in the program where we go through the biggest story of the week, the sleeper story, the most remarkable story, and our favourite story, and see whether we agree on any of them.
Righto.
I think we will agree on the biggest story of the week. It would be the markets, right?
Absolutely. When an economy is at an inflection point, which is what's happening in Australia and around the world, it's really quite difficult to see the next few months ahead. It also means there are plenty of investment opportunities. In 6 months' time, we'll look back at this period and say, well, it's probably not that difficult to work out that global growth will emerge in a certain way and inflation will take off in some way. But when you're in the middle of it, it's actually really hard. And I think in terms of big stories around the globe, financial markets is the big one at the moment.
Look, I actually also agree with you on the sleeper story for this week, and it is about Ace Power.
2 in a row, Michael.
2 in a row. I have a feeling, I've just got a hunch that stories 3 and 4 there might be a bit of disagreement on. But the sleeper, we're aligned on it because it's about Ace Power. A German group wants to spend $2.5 billion in Australia on renewables. The thing that makes it such an interesting story for me is not just the amount of money. $2.5 billion is a lot, but the fact that it's kind of a sign of things to come, really.
I think so. I think a lot of investors, and particularly European investors who are a little bit more advanced in their thinking around renewables, will come to Australia. There's huge opportunity here. We have such a big landmass. We have so much sunshine, so much wind. We have the ability to store power. When you have those things, I think you will find investment in Australia, not so much so that they can somehow transport that energy back to Europe, but so that Australia can power the region, Australia and the Asia Pacific and even beyond. That's why I think it is a sleeper story, as you do. Europeans coming, investing in Australian renewables.
Yeah, really big opportunity. Remarkable story for the week. Sean, what is your pick?
Well, I think it's quite remarkable that for the first time since the Second World War, the adult male population average age declined last year. Now, that's on the back of COVID because of the number of deaths, but every generation seems to get older, and it always has been that way, except for last year, where life expectancy fell by 2.2 years. We're getting younger, and only a pandemic can do that. What do you think is the most remarkable story, Michael?
Well, you're not going to believe it, but it's nearly the same story.
Oh.
It is very, very similar to that story, but it is the story about the causes of death in Australia during the pandemic and the fact that heart disease last year was in fact lower than 2019, which is the first time the annual number of fatalities has fallen since 2009. And then there's a host of other regular causes of death, dementia, strokes, lung cancer, other respiratory diseases. All of those fell during lockdowns. And the main reason for that was the public health measures that were in place, social distancing, lockdowns, etc. Really meant then that even things like the flu didn't spread. And COVID-19, I think, was the 38th ranked cause of death. But just the overall flow-on effect of those public health measures on other normal causes of death, to me, makes it the remarkable story of the week.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, Michael, what about your favourite story of the week?
Well, my favourite story of the week was actually on Monday, and so I called it very early at the time.
Very early.
And it is about the European Union wanting smartphones to have a uniform charging cord. So no longer are you going to have to find one charging cord for your iPhone and a different cord for your Samsung phone. It's just one cord for all phones. It is a common sense story. It just makes sense to make the change. So that's why the European Union deserves to be the favourite story of the week.
Look, I kind of agree with you, but I don't want to be 3.5 out of 4 here, so I'm going to totally disagree with you and talk about TikTok having 1 billion active users. After just 4 years, it's got 1 billion people using it. Now, school closures, telecommuting, all that stuff has really helped it. My kids are now singing 80s and 90s music, helps me out. So that, for me, is my favourite story.
And if we get you on there, it's 1 billion and one.
Go on. Go on.
Let's have a look at the interviews from the week. Monday was a really interesting chat. That was with Jason Cooper, the CEO of EnviroSuite. It's a fascinating company, EnviroSuite, and it's one that Matthew Kidman from Centennial Asset Management picked out as a stock to watch a while ago, just because they are finding technological solutions to environmental problems around the world, from kind of Heathrow measuring kind of airport noise right through to water quality and air quality right around the world. So as people start to shift, as companies and governments start to really focus on these environmental measures, they're going to need technology that's able to deliver the outcomes, and EnviroSuite's kind of positioned to do that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting company, that one. Tuesday's chat was with Peter Fitzsimons from the Australian Republic Movement, also an author and journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. Peter is always entertaining. And just given all the stuff that's going on around Australia's relationships with the US and the UK, our relationship with China, I just thought it was a good time to talk to Peter to see where the Australian Republic movement's up to. And he is a great enthusiast, if nothing else.
He certainly is. Now, Wednesday's interview was a great one for me to listen to. You spoke to Evan Lucas, the head of strategy at InvestSmart, and he basically went through resources, iron ore, base metals, batteries, gold companies, and tried to make sense of what's been happening lately. So a really interesting one to kind of give yourself a bit of a base understanding of why things are what they are at the moment.
Then Thursday's interview is with Doug McNamee from Jolt Charge. This is the group that's rolling out electric vehicle stations, charging stations in Adelaide and Sydney. I don't know much about that, and that's why I found that interview so interesting, because I learned how much you have to pay, how it works, how a car goes and pulls up and plugs in, that type of thing. Really interesting interview and a great model.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that they have a $100 million investment from BlackRock.
Helpful.
Certainly suggests that they might be onto something there. Now, on Friday, you spoke to Christian Rader from Cardinia Capital. That was a good chat.
Sure was. We started off about reflation trade, which is about what sectors you should invest in when things are getting better. But in the end, we went through everywhere. We talked about banks and resource stocks. We talked about consumer staple stocks, and then the more interest rate linked stocks like real estate investment trusts and discretionary consumer stocks. And we basically went through the whole ASX 200 in about 12 minutes.
Yeah, it was a fantastic chat. Highly recommend that one for any investors or anybody just looking to get a good understanding of what happens when the economy starts to open up again. If you do want to listen to any of the interviews or indeed any of the shows over the past week, they're all available on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au, which is also where you can sign up for our new newsletter, which is released every weekday morning. Don't forget that tomorrow morning we'll be back with Adam Lang as well from the Fear and Greed team to have a bit more of an in-depth look at some of the news around the place. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I'm Michael Thompson. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.